But it came very close to us. We got the
to Jay Bush, you know? Like, possibly. Immediately after I absolutely have like half an hour.
Yeah, even
well, yeah.
Sure.
that kind of thing.
That's my best window is right after the hearing.
Yeah. I'll grab your rate. Cool. Maybe we can
Thank you. Oh, that's good. No, I appreciate that. Who are you with? Ooh, call it a pronoun.
rebuilding houses, better and better.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, right.
Liam?
That worked in my way.
Liam, meet this lady.
Yeah. I would have preferred a one-day strike mission. It's a little too far.
Well, you're based out of Denver, right?
Boulder.
Boulder,
But yeah, you do Denver Airport.
I still go down.
You can. Okay. No. Oh, I can't either. I had to come out.
Testing 1, 2. I got something.
Thank you.
Testing, testing.
So, no, we're pleased.
I don't, mine's not registering.
Well, if we're out of pens though, we need to like get you back.
This chair is not in the center of the We don't need a council. Well, no, but even, you only have 4 here.
Right, so we have 2 seats here. Now, we can move it.
We have 4 here.
Sorry. Do you want to take a guess? Okay, we'll just. Everything is a bit off about this side, so I apologize for that. We were trying to figure out which was the center. There's only gonna be one person back there.
What's going right?
It would be Miller.
Miller's down?
So there's only gonna be one person down there? No, Miller is Miller, that's what I'm saying, Miller would be up here.
That keyboard.
Sorry.
Yeah, when you do a second row, it starts senior and goes in. So the most junior people are sitting next to each other.
Do you want us to move people inward then? Instead of having them on the edges?
Here, you do it soon.
I believe he's the.
Yeah, so
I have your life on your chair. Just give me 1 second.
okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They're digital natives. It's not fair fight.
Sorry.
Yeah. That or they'll just be looking around in their glasses and waiting. No, it's good for them cleaned up.
I thought we didn't want to council seat.
Yeah, we don't need to have so much. This is the center.
I understand. There's
Why did you, Mr. Louis? No, we were gonna just take the council.
Sorry, hold on.
Member Mike 1, test, test. Member Mike 1, test, test.
Okay, so now the teacher is back up here.
Member Mike 1, test, test. Member Mike 1, check, check, test, test.
Testing 1, 2.
Can we get the extra cup? Wherever that is. Can we get an extra cup? Can we get an extra cup? Or the cup that's over there? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. The committee will come to order. Welcome to the July 25th, 2019 hearing of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today we will discuss the risks, costs, and opportunities that businesses, investors, and the economy face as a result of the climate crisis. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today we're examining the escalating risks and costs of the climate crisis. When we look at these risks, we see some big numbers. And when businesses across America look at the growing risks, they also see huge peril ahead. In 2017 alone, insurance companies paid out a record $135 billion in climate losses, with $100 billion just in the United States. The world's largest businesses estimate that they face nearly $1 trillion of climate-related risks. That's trillion with a T. The risks have gotten so large, the Federal Reserve is now interested. This fall, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is hosting its first conference on how the banking system will deal with climate change. The Fed has identified climate change as one of 3 forces transforming the economy this century, and experts there recognize the need to understand the financial implications of it to fulfill their obligation to foster financial stability. The numbers are eye-popping, but the costs come in real human terms. When a home or business floods, a cascade of financial implications follows. The value takes a hit. They may have to relocate and pay to live or work somewhere else. The insurance company has to cover their losses. The reinsurance company has to cover the insurance company's losses. And evidence shows that these losses will continue to grow. And when the disaster is large, we step in here in the Congress because we have an obligation to our fellow Americans when disasters strike. But experts say we should be investing more to avoid disasters in the first place. Rising heat projections highlight other serious risks. When we face brutal heat waves, it's too hot to work outside. People who work outside don't get paid for not working. And I want everyone to think back to just a few days ago with the massive, brutal heat wave that kept many of our neighbors inside and off the job. That's the type of heat that wilts crops. It's the type of heat that keeps us cooped up indoors instead of enjoying our summers. And when we face heat like that, businesses take a hit too. Many sectors of the economy are impacted and the risks will grow. So thank you to our witnesses today for being here, for kicking off what needs to be an ongoing dialogue with members of this committee relating to the material risks of the climate crisis for businesses, insurers, and all Americans. Climate change is impacting our economy now, not 50 years from now. It's happening now. This is important because for years, big businesses ignored the climate crisis. Some even actively promoted climate denial. Some still do, but increasingly with the help of experts who measure growing economic risks, with the help of scientists and shareholder activists, businesses not only recognize the growing economic harm of the climate crisis, but they recognize that we can solve it and create new opportunities, create new industries, and grow jobs. Recognizing the risks, investors are getting out of fossil fuels. They're looking at opportunities to create the next wave of clean energy and clean transportation technology. They're building the clean energy economy because that must be the future. It's no longer business as usual. We need to go further. We need to make a 100% clean energy future our shared objective. As we heard in our second hearing, global carbon emissions need to reach net zero by 2050 to give us a chance of avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. The alternative isn't just unacceptable, it's dangerous. It will be very costly to everyone. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses about how Congress can highlight their work regarding the growing risks, shift the country to clean energy, and protect the places that we know and love. At this time, I'll recognize Ranking Member Graves for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I appreciate you joining us and those in the audience as well. Madam Chair, as you know, we can look across the United States, and through the Corps of Engineers Water Resource Program, we have about $100 billion in project authorizations. Many of these are the projects that are designed to improve the resilience of this nation. This is a key issue that we must aggressively address. And let's be clear, the status quo, what we have done historically for decades, is absolutely inappropriate. It doesn't properly prioritize. It is not the process that corresponds to the urgency that we're facing. As you well know, we can reduce, as we've had witness after witness testify before this committee, we could cut all emissions from the United States today, every bit of emissions, and we're going to continue to see changes in our weather. We're going to continue to see seas rise, especially when you recognize the fact that climate change is a global issue. You recognize the fact that the United States has actually reduced emissions by approximately 1 billion tons. And during that same period of time, China has increased their emissions by 4 billion tons. There is momentum built up in the environment and in the climate. If we do not have truly a global approach to this, then no matter how aggressive the efforts are in the United States, it will not change the trajectory that we're on. We also need to recognize the importance or the urgency of resiliency, because even if we cut all emissions from around the globe, we would continue to have momentum and continue to have change in our environment. One of the reasons that we have sought to try to break this backlog of Corps of Engineers and other resiliency projects is because of the need to ensure our communities are adapting, to ensure our coastal communities are safe. As we've discussed in this committee before, you can take the coastal counties, parishes, and boroughs around the United States. They only constitute 10%, just 10% of the actual land area. Yet, over 40% of the population lives there. We cannot allow for this slow and expensive process to continue to thwart our efforts to become the more resilient nation that we should be, that continues to thwart our ability to adapt to the changes that we're seeing. Just recently, we offered an amendment to the appropriations bill for energy and water, trying to facilitate this process of reevaluating the Corps of Engineers' efforts and how in the world we got to a $100 billion backlog while presidents from Clinton forward have requested less than $2 billion in construction funds. And we were thwarted in that effort to try to change, to try to move this mission up and make it a priority by this very Congress, the same people that are sitting here talking about how we need to adapt, we need to be resilient, effectively are affirming this both slow and expensive process that has prevented our nation from making the proactive investments that we need to make. I do want to highlight that within the last 2 years, we have been able to make some progress, and that we made some of the most substantial investments in resiliency that we have ever made in the United States. We have changed the definition of resilience, or actually allowed for the definition of resilience to actually be established whenever we have disasters, to come back and actually build smarter, not build back the same way, build higher, build stronger, providing for more adaptation, providing for more flexibility under our Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, under our Stafford Act amendments that we did in October of last year. So, Madam Chair, look, I agree 100% that we have got to be a resilient nation, but we have to have the tools, we have to have the processes in place that recognize the urgency of the challenges that we're facing today. My home state of Louisiana, we've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast. The reason Arkansas doesn't evacuate when hurricanes come is because they have a buffer. It's called Louisiana. Our buffer's gone. Our buffer's gone. And that's why in 2005, when you saw Hurricane Katrina hit our coast, it became a quick wake-up call for many people, recognizing that the loss of our coast is not a habitat problem for birds and fish. It's an economic problem. It's a historic preservation problem. It's a problem for economic development. It's a problem for homes and businesses, one of the most pervasive problems you can possibly explain or experience. James Carville, a New Orleans resident, described it as a war. And you know what? He's right. So, Madam Chair, I look forward to working with you to ensure that we can develop a government response or perhaps proactive approach to resiliency that our nation deserves. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record have 5 business days to do so. Now I want to welcome our witnesses. Paula DePerna is a special advisor at CDP. Through CDP, more than 500 U.S. companies disclose information about their environmental performance. Ms. DePerna previously served as a vice president for the Chicago Climate Exchange and led the Joyce Foundation. Garvin J. Bush is the Chief Investment Officer and co-founder of Green Alpha Advisors, a financial services firm focused on sustainable fossil-free investment strategies. Prior to Green Alpha Advisors, Mr. J. Bush served in many roles in the financial industry, including as Vice President of Strategic Services at Morgan Stanley. Jay Walker is the Executive Vice President of Commercial Lending at South Louisiana Bank. Mr. Walker is also the president of the Morganza Action Coalition, which advocates for the authorization and funding of the Morganza to the Gulf Hurricane Protection System. Francis Bochar is the head of sustainability at Zurich Insurance Group, one of the world's 100 largest companies. Zurich has run a global flood insurance program since 2013. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made a part of the record. With that, Ms. DePerna, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation.
I'll repeat my thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your service to our country. I also want to thank Chairman Castor especially for her leadership of the committee, Ranking Member Graves for that very insightful statement, and Speaker Pelosi for convening the committee. I know well her commitment to addressing climate change dating back at least to 2007, when she led a vanguard effort to create a zero-emissions target for these very buildings in the House. Now we come together again, and perhaps we feel a bit like the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland, running around with a clock and being late, late, late for a very important date. A date we all have with our destiny to recognize the climate change challenge for what it is, the greatest impetus in a generation to create jobs, retool, reset, and modernize our economy and protect our people. A few words on CDP, which operates as a public good. Launched in 2003 as the Carbon Disclosure Project, we pioneered the idea of specific environmental disclosure to shareholders. Today, as you've just heard, we have roughly 650 companies in the U.S. and Canada disclosing to us voluntarily, 70% of the S&P 500, and about 500 signatory investors representing most of the world's financial service sector who use CDP as a reference on corporate environmental performance and investment decisions. Our annual request is global, qualitative, and quantitative, aligned with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, and to an extent, we model ourselves on the SEC EDGAR system for 10K filings. In fact, we're a standardized one-stop shopping information platform on the doability and the desirability of addressing climate change, and we are unique in the world. A word about me. My CV's in the record, but suffice it to say that I'm proud to say I've seen climate change from 360 degrees, from coral reefs to carbon markets, literally. On the subject of today's hearing, climate resilience and business views, this month CDP issued a comprehensive report on the two things that the chairwoman just referenced, risks and opportunities. On risks, of the world's 500 largest companies, 215 companies representing $17 trillion in market cap did reference near-term financial risk from climate change at nearly $1 trillion, with over half of those risks reported as likely, very likely, or virtually certain to materialize in 5 years or earlier. Of those 215 companies, 81 are based here in the United States. On the opportunities side, on the other hand, the opportunities seem to outsize the risks, with 225 of the world's 500 biggest companies reporting potential upside totaling nearly $2 trillion. Of these 225, 89 are based in the United States. And I can answer questions about the forces involved in those numbers. Notably, on the opportunities side, Companies headquartered in the United States, among the largest 500, reported less than half the potential opportunities than their EU counterparts. And it's possible that the policy framework evolving in the EU, which is consistent with the Paris Agreement, that global regime that you referenced, Mr. Graves, supports an opportunity viewpoint by offering reasonable regulatory certainty conducive to investment. As to how risks are expressed by companies themselves, following are just a few examples with additional examples in my written testimony and in our repository. Harris Corporation, Jacksonville, Florida, close to 7,000 employees, sees risks for their data centers, reduction in operational efficiency, and increased component failure rates as increases in average temperatures and associated humidity will affect baseline design parameters, end of quote. Conagra, with headquarters in Chicago, in our forest disclosure said, quote, our paper suppliers are impacted by U.S. flooding caused by extreme weather and exacerbated by climate change, and forest fires exacerbated by drought that have appeared with increasing frequency over the past few years. Yum Brands, based in Louisville, Kentucky, with 38,000 employees and operating 48,000 restaurants in the world, 145 companies, they say, says, quote, climate change influences could negatively impact production, including extreme weather events, changes in precipitation and temperature, forest fires, loss of ecosystem services, reduced crop yields, and thus availability of certified sustainable material, which is already limited. Eli Lilly, based in Indianapolis, said, quote, changing precipitation patterns, droughts, flooding, and tropical cyclones could potentially damage our manufacturing, research, and development. Our principal active ingredient manufacturing occurs in our U.S., Ireland, and Puerto Rico sites. Puerto Rico, where we employ 1,400 people, was devastated by Hurricane Maria. I will stop here just to bring back later our reference to Matchmaker, which has a tremendous listing of climate-resilient projects, 108 costed projects just in the states represented by this committee, ranging from the Embarcadero seawall in St. Louis to $23 million in Gretna, Louisiana. I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Mr. Jabis, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'd like to add my thanks, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, for the opportunity to testify today. Climate disruption and resource degradation both present significant threats and opportunities for American business. We know that. Every industry is affected, and since my business of asset management deploys capital across the economy, it's exposed to all these risks and opportunities inclusively. So risks. In investing, the purpose of it is to preserve and grow our purchasing power. There are volumes of portfolio theory written about how to do this, and those theories have worked well for decades, but many theories of the world work great until the world changes. Now the change is climate disruption, and in the exercise of fiduciary duty, I have to think about the effects the climate crisis will have on every business I consider placing my clients' assets into. And inversely, I have to think about the effect each business may have upon the climate. In doing this analysis, I minimize risk and can grow my client's purchasing power into the future. Now, the application of this is simple. It's in realizing that science is our path to knowing things. And science tells us that many of our present economic activities, like fossil fuel development, like internal combustion engines, use of topsoil depleting chemicals, have to decline dramatically and soon. So the prudent fiduciary knows that holding securities of companies pursuing these activities will put client assets at risk regardless of time horizon, as Madam Chair has noted in her opening remarks. According to experts like former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney and investor Jeremy Grantham, and again, as Chair Castor mentions, the Fed itself, climate has emerged as bar none the most important risk in asset management. And so, the main threat to investments today is in holding the causes of the climate crisis. De-risking a portfolio, therefore, means not owning key threats to that economic stability. So, those are the risks within my industry. The main risk to the climate that comes from my industry is that the dominant way of investing today flat ignores the climate crisis, indexing. A CNBC.com article explains that, quote, 80% of the stock market is now on autopilot, end quote. That means today, the reason a stock is bought, usually, is because it's in an index, not because of what the company makes or service it provides. This is dangerous because the major indexes are packed with causes of our risks. The S&P 500 alone includes about 60 fossil fuels-related companies and any number of risks to water, to topsoil, to economic equality, to name a few. So let's be clear. If you own the S&P 500 today, you think you're investing passively, but you're not. You're making an active bet on the causes of system-level collapse. By your actions, if not your intent, you're signaling that you hope to benefit from causing climate disruption. The climate crisis is the most important risk to capital preservation, yet the main risk coming from the investment industry is that the majority of professionals are ignoring that and, worse, investing in its causes. There are those in investments working to change this, my firm among them. It sounds simple to invest for a sustainable economy, but investment managers haven't had great principles yet to guide them. So our approach to de-risking portfolios is to select stocks not because of their presence in an index, but because of what the company does. We think the clearest line of sight there is to look at source of revenues, simply. Is a company being paid to help de-risk the economy, or does it get paid to help drive it towards the edge? If a company's net activities do not mitigate risk on an ongoing basis, we shouldn't own it. Investing has to get back to judging individual cases on their merits, and we can use disinterested, objective principles to make better choices. You get the economy you invest in, and while most investors still own the S&P 500, we will be living in the fossil fuels economy that it represents. All right, those are risks for my industry and how to avoid them, but what about opportunities? Well, this is where there's good news, and it's that innovation is increasing, and the rate of that increase is itself accelerating. So innovation just means doing things better. It means more efficient economic production, getting more output from fewer inputs. As E.O. Wilson has noted, and I note that he was here on the Hill a couple days ago talking, digitalization is key to achieving sustainability because growing efficiency of production shrinks our ecological footprint. And we now have the means to mitigate climate disruption, means from fields from advanced materials and biotech to renewable energy and storage to zero emissions transport and adaptations like indoor agriculture. Investing in solutions like these will drive performance at the portfolio level as these innovators gain market share from legacy predecessors. So economic production can and will be much greater than it is today while consuming far fewer inputs like natural resources, dollars, and person hours, and with fewer externalities. This will create enormous wealth and result in a sustainable economy, meaning we can realize good standards of living for the 100% without overtopping Earth's capacity. The greatest opportunity to grow wealth is in investing for that end game. That end game is a zero-risk economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and committee members. My name is Jay Walker. I'm from Houma, Louisiana, and I'm the EVP and Chief of Lending at South Louisiana Bank, a community bank in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today to discuss creating a climate-resilient America. In the last 3 decades, my bank and community have experienced 13 named storms. The latest, Hurricane Barry, was less than 2 weeks ago. Both my bank and my community long ago decided to pull up our bootstraps and do whatever it takes to build resiliency and to continue to make our living in South Louisiana. It is important for members to know that Louisiana is a working coast, and those of us who live in the coastal Louisiana do largely in service of our nation's energy and seafood needs. While diverse, our community's economy is driven by these 2 industries, and moving is simply not an option. For the people of South Louisiana, being resilient in the face of climate change and other challenges is a way of life. We've been doing it for decades. There's a hope for communities and businesses that pull together and take action to prepare and protect themselves from the inevitable process of climate change, erosion, subsidence, and other challenges. In spite of these challenges, my bank has maintained a loan loss reserve of 2.5 times higher and capital of 31% greater than our peers. I'm not telling you this to brag, but to point out that when you live and operate in an environment with increased risk, you have to maintain resiliency to make it through the tough times. While my day-to-day job is to provide our region's banking needs, I'm also very active in the community, and those efforts are intertwined. My community's survival is tied to managing risk from a manipulated delta and a channelized Mississippi River. Efforts to aid the nation's waterborne commerce have had a severe impact on our community, namely subsidence, seeking wetlands. Since 1992, the communities in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes have been the subject of federal studies to build levee protection projects in order to protect our citizens from the risk of hurricanes. The levee protection project, called the Morganza to the Gulf, is a 98-mile hurricane protection levee system. This project has been before Congress 4 times since 2000 and was finally authorized for construction in the 2014 WRDA at a cost of $10.3 billion. But to date, we have received no federal funding. In 2006, the Morganza Action Coalition was formed to advocate for the federal funding to complete the levee protection project. I am currently the president of MAC, and my bank has contributed over $70,000 to MAC to support advocacy to build large-scale levee protection. This 501c4 nonprofit's efforts have been critical to moving our federal partner, largely to get out of the way of local efforts, but to date, virtually all of our protection has been constructed from local and state revenues to the tune of over $400 million. Our community, with the state support and local dedicated taxes, has partially built more than 45 miles of levees, 9 floodgates. Let me say it again. After years of waiting for federal funding, our communities, both in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes, voted to tax themselves to begin building this system. The most recent tax vote for an additional half-cent in Terrebonne Parish passed in December 12 by a 72% voter margin. We have taxed ourselves more than any other coastal community in America to reduce risk largely caused by federal actions. Just 2 weeks ago, a Cat 1 hurricane named Barry barreled through the Gulf of Mexico on a similar path to Hurricanes Rita in 05 and Ike in 08. But the difference this time was that less than 15 homes flooded in Terrebonne Parish versus 1,100 for Rita and upwards of over 10,000 that flooded in Ike. In South Lafourche, where the levee system is even more complete, no homes flooded. It is imperative that our coastal communities complete this levee protection project to protect us from up to a Cat 3 hurricane. The most recent U.S. Corps of Engineers study evaluating the cost of the Morganza to Gulf levee, which used actual cost data from completed sections, indicates that more accurate cost to complete the project is estimated to be $3.4 billion. 1/3 of the original $10.3 billion estimate. We believe our $400 million plus spent on flood protection so far has probably saved at least that much in flood damages for Hurricane Barry, a single storm. In a couple of months, Congress will be looking at long-term solutions for the National Flood Insurance Program. Think of the savings that the communities of Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish would have had on mitigating of flood claims from the completion of our levee system. The Morganza to the Gulf Levee Protection Project is an investment that the citizens of my community have made to build resiliency to climate crisis. Is there a cost? Yes, but the cost of not building and preparing are much greater. I encourage Congress to step up and invest in building the Morganza to the Gulf Levee Protection Project and others like it, which will, in the end, will save taxpayers billions of dollars. Thank you for allowing me to be with you today, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bashar, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name is Francis Bouchard, and I am the Head of Public Affairs and Sustainability for Zurich Insurance Group. Zurich is a leading direct insurer that has been serving customers around the world for nearly 150 years, including over 100 years in the U.S. As a risk management expert, we have identified climate change as perhaps the most complex risk facing society. It is intergenerational, it is international, and it is interdependent. We concur with the IPCC findings, and it is our aim to leverage our sector's role in society to help deepen awareness of climate risks and to incentivize the behaviors and best practices that will be required to mitigate against and adapt to the worst impacts of climate change. As an insurer, this effort is core to our mission, and as a responsible steward of the planet, it is simply the right thing to do. It is clear that the frequency of extreme weather events is increasing. NOAA captures this trend well in its analysis of billion-dollar weather-related disasters, with the 3-year average of 15 such events per year far exceeding the 30-year average of 6.2 events per year. Perhaps even more alarming, though, is the growing gap between overall economic losses and insured losses, both in the developing world and in the U.S., a phenomena insurers call the protection gap. The committee has asked witnesses to address the costs of climate change to businesses. In our view, those costs come in 2 primary forms: physical risks and transition risks, both of which present complex risk management challenges. This is why we view the disclosure regime, such as the one developed by the Financial Stability Board, to be constructive first steps for boards, management teams, and investors to improve risk-aware decision-making. As for managing our own physical and transition risks, Zurich has taken concrete steps. We became carbon neutral in 2014, decreasing our own CO2 emissions per employee by 50% from our 2007 operations, recently committing to use 100% renewable energy across our global operations. We also set targets to reduce the use of internal paper by 80% and eliminate the use of single-use plastics. In reality, though, insurers are relatively small emitters of carbon, so our ultimate impact will be achieved through our marketplace role, both as an institutional investor and as an insurer of risks. As an investor, we proactively evaluate ESG factors in our investment decision-making process, with over 87% of our in-scope investments already meeting or exceeding our minimum standards. We are also major impact investors, and by year-end 2018, had invested $3.8 billion, avoiding 3.5 million tons of CO2 and benefiting 2.4 million people. Like other economic sectors, it is still quite early in the evolution of a climate-focused insurance market. That said, we have products that encourage or even encourage better or even less driving, cover electric vehicles, and offer Build Back Better options. We developed the first dedicated carbon capture and sequestration liability offering, increased our renewable energy sector business, and are bolstering our modeling capabilities to support clients who are seeking to deepen their own understanding of climate exposures. As market demands evolve then, insurers are developing products and services that will help facilitate or even incentivize longer-term resilient behaviors. In some cases, though, we feel the need to accelerate those trends, which is why Zurich recently announced a new policy to engage in risk-based dialogues over a 2-year period with customers or those companies we invest in that have significant commercial operations in thermal coal, oil sands, and oil shales. The aim is to drive a deeper conversation regarding their mid to long-term transition plans for reducing the carbon intensity of their operations. The insurance mechanism has a clear role to play in helping society manage climate risks. However, a model that prices risk over a 12-month period, no matter how sophisticated the methodology, will struggle to fully reflect longer-term evolving exposures like climate change. In those cases, insurers must find new ways to play their role in society that go well beyond the traditional products and services they provide. That is why Zurich and other insurers have undertaken a series of knowledge-based initiatives to work with other societal actors to apply the analytics of insurance to a much broader group of stakeholders. In 2013, as the chairwoman referenced, we launched our Global Flood Alliance, and with NGO and academic partners, we deployed a sophisticated resilience framework in over 100 at-risk communities, and have now expanded the program to broaden our impact even further. Today, 87% of disaster-related funding goes to post-event recovery, and it is our goal to demonstrate both the humanitarian and economic benefits of shifting more funding to pre-event preparation. Another approach we take to sharing our knowledge about resilience is through the publication of PERC reports that assess human-induced elements of what are typically considered natural disasters, with the research revealing several important truths as outlined in my written statement. Finally, we are proud of our affiliation with SBP, a national resiliency nonprofit located in New Orleans, which has evolved into a true system-level thought leader on disaster preparedness and recovery, particularly for the most vulnerable at-risk populations. In closing, let me acknowledge that the precise costs of climate change are difficult to calculate and are subject to unknown future scenarios. That should not inhibit business from acting, though, which is why we are proud of the role that insurers are playing to help society prepare for and address the costs associated with climate change. At Zurich, we take that responsibility seriously and are eager to work with others who share that commitment. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. At this time, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. DePerna, in the 2019 status report by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, a majority of the respondents said their organizations consider climate-related issues to be a material risk today and over the near term. Climate change is costing companies now, not 50 years from now. How are companies managing that risk, and what actions are they taking to mitigate it? If there are obstacles and challenges that companies see that the Congress should address, what would you recommend? I know.
We only have a few minutes, but, and I'm not really in the position to recommend policy, but with regard to what is disclosed to us, certainly return on investment. Companies are trying to manage these risks. Well, first of all, you can ask Mr. Bouchard from Zurich Re. You know, insurance is a very big topic, very relevant, what I call the 3 I's, insurance, indemnification, and infrastructure. So companies are looking at all those 3. How can we indemnify ourselves against the risk, build in protections against physical risk, modernize equipment? They're they're seeing higher premiums, but also the return on investment data that we're getting from disclosure is really interesting, because most of the investments companies are making to address the risk, either by avoiding it, eliminating it, or building an alternative product, the returns on those investments tend to come in sooner than expected and at a higher rate of return. So I think what we're seeing is companies are very, very nimble, but it is true, as I said earlier, that these risks are, I won't use the word material myself because as a fiduciary meaning, but are significant and due to fall on us, due to fall on somebody within the next 5 years. And one thing, sorry.
Well, you mentioned that in the EU, they have appreciated regulatory certainty because they have maintained their commitment to the goals set out in the Paris Climate Accord, and that it's a little more iffy here. Can you address that? Here in
Yes,
the
well,
US?
I think regulatory certainty, and I was just speaking with one of my colleagues earlier who spent some time at the National Academy of Sciences this week, where some of our data do show now that regulatory uncertainty is being registered as a risk. And I mentioned that one of the very largest utilities in the company has stipulated that it's sometimes more difficult to manage the uncertainty of regulation than the challenges of climate change. But as we know, regulation is not it shouldn't be seen, in my opinion, as a restriction. It's at the least a level playing field. And if you want to be competitive, you have to know what your competitors are doing. And the coherence of something like the Paris Agreement, even though it has its shortcomings, does provide everybody a report card on what other people are doing. So if you want to make a capital investment, you want to be sure that it's not going to somehow be undermined in 2 years if there's a new policy or a higher tax rate or something you can't predict. Business hates unpredictability.
Mr. Bouchard, boy, we are just being socked by the cost of these extreme weather events now. In 2017, the U.S. faced the highest single total cost related to extreme weather events on record, totaling over $312 billion. In 2018, we saw the fourth highest extreme weather cost at $91 billion worldwide. In 2017, 2018 were the costliest back-to-back years for weather disasters ever recorded. People are on the front lines, but insurers are on the front lines with them. Insured losses in 2017 totaled $100 billion in the United States alone. So what does this mean going forward for the average ratepayer? And then you also talked about the important investor mission that our insurance companies have. And are they actively mitigating, are they actively transitioning away from fossil fuel investments because they know the impact on the bottom line?
So first, I mean, your numbers are accurate, and that's what we're seeing as well. We're seeing the trend lines are clear, and they're not reversing. We may have, I think we just saw numbers for the first half of this year, meaning of actually a lower catastrophe year, which is great news. But over time, the numbers you cite are absolutely accurate and are the same numbers that we're working with and trying to model as well. In terms of what it means for ratepayers, it really depends on the risks that they face today. I mean, I try to make that case in the testimony that sending risk signals in 12-month insurance policies when the risk, yes, it's escalated today, but the real escalation will happen over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it does not reflect the full escalation of the risk in today's rates. It will come. And I do think we're seeing in parts of the country insurance rates, not only this country but other countries, insurance rates starting to rise to reflect the increased risk. But that is our role in society to do that. And it is the signal we send. We are a bit of the canary in the coal mine saying, you know, risk is up, so price is up. You know, the second question you ask about our role as investors, the answer is absolutely yes. We are applying ESG filters to, at this point,
go ahead and explain.
Environmental, social, and governance filters to 87% of our investment portfolio. We announced our decision, as I referenced, to begin to have dialogues and perhaps even divest and stop underwriting certain carbon-intensive sectors.
I saw that
of fossil
Chubb
fuel.
Insurance made an
Chubb
announcement
has done that as
last week
well. There are
for
a number
coal-related investments.
there are a number of insurers who have done that, yeah. So we certainly are looking at the carbon intensity of our investment portfolio and taking actions appropriately.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Palmer, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to talk a little bit about the storm damages, there's a report out from Roger Pelkey who supports the idea of human-caused climate change, but he points out that over the last 20, 30 years that as a percentage of global GDP, storm damages are actually lower than they were, say, in 1990. And also point out that when you look at it historically, the dollar values are more reflective of the fact that we've got more structures, more people living in coastal areas. And then I add one last point to that, is that the International Panel on Climate Change last report indicated that the number of Atlantic storms, particularly those are the ones that tend to impact our coastal regions the most, have not increased in number nor intensity. Mr. Walker, would you like to comment on that?
We've noticed that they come in waves, down where we are, we tend to have storms and cycles. And so, you look back all the way to Hurricane Andrew, then we had Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike. I mean, it does come in cycles. I can't tell you that it looks like it's any more severe, but we've been through a pretty good stretch where we did not have storms.
A record.
We were able to
period
get
of
some
time.
things done down where we are to help protect us. And so, I can't really, comment too much on the science of it, but, we just know they're coming. I've been dealing with storms since I was born. I was born right before Hurricane Betsy in Houma. And so, I mean, we face storms constantly down there. And what we do know is if we don't do anything to protect ourselves, that we're gonna pay the damage.
Well-
We seem to be gaining some progress right now.
That's one of the main points that I've been trying to make as a participant on this committee, is that we know that the climate is changing. There's a historical record that indicates that the climate changes and it will continue to change. The thing that concerns me is the lack of attention in regard to preparing for that change. Using our technology and our engineering capability to prepare for that, to be able to adapt and mitigate. And I think that's one of the bigger issues. We seem to be wrapped around the axle about it's all about carbon when there are certain natural things that are occurring that we can't do anything about, that's going to impact us. I also want to go back to this issue of preparation to adapt and mitigate. Your state particularly has had a difficult time with the Corps of Engineers in doing some mitigation work. We had a hearing. I was chairman of a subcommittee on the Oversight Committee, and we had a hearing with a representative from the Army Corps of Engineers. And I asked how many studies they had underway that were over 5 years old, and he said about 100, which frankly shocked me. It might not have shocked my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, but I found that shocking. So I asked them to send me a list of them. And among those were the Comeet River that had been studied for 30-something years about building a diversion canal from the Comeet River over to the Lily Bayou. And Louisiana residents had been concerned about a possible major flood and the damage that it caused. And of course, in 2016, you had that flood, lost lives, billions of dollars in property damage. And they finally decided to build that canal. They've broken ground on it. But out of that list of studies, and there were 97 of them actually, 40-something of them were more than 5 years old. The Corps of Engineers has spent $140 million on that. That's part of my concern, and particularly when you're dealing with insurance and stuff, is that we're not investing infrastructure-wise, technology-wise, in preparing for the climate change that we know will come, that we must be prepared to adapt to and have a mitigation strategy. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we've faced the same thing down where we live. All the way since 2000, we've been trying to get levees built. At some point, we just decided it was time to do something on our own. Actually, right after Katrina, it really helped things happen because we could see that we just had to do something. And so we just decided we were going to do it ourselves. Our neighboring parish, Lafourche Parish, had done it years before that. They had protected themselves with levees. And all of those storms that came through there, when they had that system, you could see they didn't flood, we flooded. I mean, it's pretty easy, simple. It's not science. So we just decided to do it. And thank goodness we did, because this past 2 weeks, we would have had the same disaster happen again. We're just recently, I think, a study was started that we asked for the Corps of Engineers, because we realized the cost of what was being estimated for that system was not what we were realizing. We could build it a lot cheaper than what that original estimate was. And so now I'm hoping that that might help, so that we at some point can break that ice and get some federal dollars to come down, because when you're 1/3 of what the original estimate was, that's a whole lot better cost to benefit ratio. Right now, the cost to benefit ratio to the federal government's infinity. We've put every dollar in, so they're getting all the benefit. We have not gotten anything. So I think it's a great time to talk about sharing and doing, breaking that backlog that we have, and maybe looking at some of those costs to see if those are realistic.
I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I really appreciate all the witnesses being here today. This is important to hear the business views on the costs of climate change. Businesses are employers, and we've had a lot of conversations in the Select Committee, on which I'm honored to serve, about the jobs that can be created and how we can address the climate crisis while supporting our economy and building and growing our economy. Just yesterday, the Washington Post covered this. A pair of studies were announced. Someone has studied global temperatures 2,000 years, over 2,000 years, and found that over the past 150 years, there has been a rise in global temperatures far more rapid than any other warming period in the past 2,000 years. So it's very timely that we're having this conversation with this work in the Select Committee. I represent Northwest Oregon, and we have an economic vitality that's very dependent on the health of our natural resources. I have the Columbia River is the northern boundary of the district. The Pacific Ocean is the western boundary. Outdoor recreation is sort of a year-round thing in Oregon, from skiing and snowboarding on Mount Hood, hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail. We have wonderful wineries that draw a lot of tourism. We have a prized Dungeness crab industry and abundant fisheries. So there's a lot that's dependent, and we know the cost of inaction is going to affect all of these industries. So we're, as I said, a hub for this industry. So outdoor recreation, Keen Footwear, I want to mention, is one business that's actively identifying harmful chemicals in their supply chain and deploying safe alternatives. Columbia Sportswear, headquartered just down the street from my office in Oregon. They're manufacturing jackets with fabric that's made from 100% recycled plastic bottles, dye-free, PFC-free, sustainably sourced down. They're really doing a lot of the businesses to be responsible, and consumers are responding positively. And I think we're going to see this across the country as businesses step up. Mr. Bouchard, I noticed you mentioned that you have a LEED certified business, and you saved 30% in water and electricity in the first year. I have in the district I represent a gold LEED certified business, First Tech Credit Union headquarters, built out of cross-laminated timber, which is kind of a win-win because they're using sustainable building materials. So Mr. Jabush, did I say your name correctly? You're close anyway?
Close, it's Ed Jabush.
You mentioned we get the economy we invest in. So are there policies, ways that we can transition our economy to one that will reward climate-responsive financial opportunities over the status quo of depending on fossil fuels and harmful pollutants?
Certainly. Similarly, I don't feel like I'm in too much of a position to recommend policy, but there are things from a macroeconomic point of view that certainly would help. Obviously a carbon tax would be huge, and probably the first and most direct thing that we could do. There are externalities, and you just listed some of them, Congresswoman, to the price of emissions, of carbon emissions. And those things do have a direct effect on the economy, on employment, as Chair Castor noted in her opening remarks. And therefore, it's not inappropriate to expect the economy and the taxpayers to get compensation for taking on the burden of those externalities directly. Currently, the emitters aren't taking those on. Someone needs to, and right now it's kind of everybody. So I think that would be the first policy, get rid of the subsidies for carbon and replace them with the carbon tax. That would be the first policy I would have in mind if I were a policymaker.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to talk about some of the other small businesses that are really trying to respond. We've had wildfires, terrible air, the health effects too that are affecting people in our communities, acidic waters, harmful algal blooms, all endangering the livelihoods of people who rely on commercial fishing, sports fishing. Mr. Perna, in your testimony, you mentioned that the climate crisis is no longer purely an environmental problem, but has significant socioeconomic effects as well. How can we improve federal support to help smaller businesses and workers better prepare for and mitigate the costs of the climate crisis?
Well, not speaking particularly officially, I mean, I think one has to look at how the risks are being distributed, as Mr. Jobs just said. These risks right now are not being priced into the economy, and they're bouncing around like a chess, if you're in a chess game, like a pawn that doesn't have a square to land on. And these risks are not hitting the general economy because the risks are being borne by you, the federal government, us, the taxpayers, FEMA, insurance companies, and the victims themselves. So I think some form of creative view of indemnification, when that risk chain hits the bottom, where does that meet? We all know that the Fed just put out a report that said 60-something% of adults can't meet a $400 cash unexpected expense. So some form of indemnification at that level, I think everyone would welcome. The carbon price, I could share data with you of how many companies have imposed on themselves voluntarily an internal carbon price to help plan for that. And certainly some form of review of the flood insurance policy. And back on jobs, I can talk all day about that. I have a lot of data to share with you.
I know I'm out of time, but real quickly, the companies that did impose that on themselves, was that driven by the leadership of the companies or by shareholders or by consumer demand? Where's that decision coming from?
So that's a good question. It sort of knits itself together. I think part of it is the expectation that there will be a regulation, because it seems like the obvious thing to do. If you have a pollutant, you have to sort of somehow, quote, penalize it. We have a long tradition in this country of talking about cap and trade. We did it with sulfur. People are experienced with this internal pricing. Also, regulations, EU, they have a carbon price, but mostly it's a planning tool. It's to make visible these invisible causes by projecting a surrogate within your system. And now, and I can give you this data, companies are also imposing voluntarily an internal water price as well. Again, to plan if they were being charged by somebody other than the moral compass, what would it cost?
Thank you. And I know I'm out of time. Thank you for your indulgence. I yield.
Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it very much. Mr. Walker, I'm looking at your testimony, and I heard your testimony when you gave it, and I find it very interesting. The Morganza Action Coalition, also known as MAC, was created apparently in 2006 to advocate for federal funding to complete the levee protection project, and you're currently the president of that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And I then noticed in the next paragraph a line that we've heard before in these hearings, and that was, you want the federal government to help, but largely to get out of the way of local efforts. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, when we decided to tax ourselves, we felt like we had the ability to do the work. And part of the problem that we've had all the way along is to get through the regulatory, blockages that we've had, getting permits, getting access to easements, negotiating those types of things. And so, part of what MAC has done, since we've not been able to get any funding, and there's not always money to be gotten, was to try to advocate and change those the ways that we have to go through that process. Sometimes it would take up to 4 years to get a permit. When 4 years, we've lost a lot of land in Louisiana.
Now, was that a Louisiana problem or a federal problem?
Well, for us, it was a Louisiana problem because we're building the levees in Terrebonne Parish.
But I mean, was it a problem of getting
At that
Louisiana
point in
permits
time,
or
it
federal
was,
permits?
it was really getting through the process with the U.S. Corps of Engineers. And we have made some progress. We have, we feel like at this point, we're gaining strides. Recently, we did get them to look at the cost again. And I think to us, that's a large step for us, to the possibility of us breaking the ice to get some federal funding. Because
And I appreciate that. What's interesting is we heard earlier from Delegate Keith Hodges of the Virginia House of Delegates celebrating this coming week their 400th anniversary of being a legislative body, and I would argue the oldest legislative body to have continuously met and be elected in the world, but they only claim North America, but I think you can make an argument. But nonetheless, he said, we're trying to do what we can on the coast of Virginia, but we run into a lot of regulatory problems and things that get in the way. Have you found it, besides the Army Corps, have you found other regulatory problems that slow you down in protecting your Louisiana
Not so much
properties?
for us. I mean, that was the biggest hurdle for us, other than funding for more construction.
All right. Now, I'm also curious that you said you'd figured out a way to cut the estimated cost by a third. And obviously, dikes or levees are not new technology. They've been around for about 3,000 years, or maybe longer. But tell me how you got that cost down to about a third of what the estimated costs were to be.
Well, we always knew what the cost was because we're building it down there.
Right.
And so we've built this system to federal standards. The alignment that we have is the same alignment that was approved by Congress. You know, we could see what we're spending on this, and so we just asked. Finally, we had the ear of the Corps, and we were able to get them to consider looking at what the real cost is. We have enough of the system built now that we know what costs are. So they've teamed with us. We've finally been able to work with them. We feel like they're on our side, and so we're hoping that that does help us finally get some funding.
And I assume that your organization, the MAC or the Morganza Action Coalition, be more than willing to share whatever you've learned in the process of building protective dikes, levees, and so forth with other states as well. Would that be correct?
Certainly, it's a little unique down where we are. We're in marshes. We're in areas that are not quite so stable that some states have, but we'd love to share the process.
Well, I have some ancestors from Louisiana, so I've always been interested in Louisiana, but I also, because our textbooks were old in the mountains of Virginia, when I was growing up, we had textbooks that talked about the ongoing project of the Zuider Z reclamation, which of course was finished in '33, but we were still studying it in the early '60s as an ongoing project. But they built a massive dike and reclaimed a huge area, which I've actually been in the Zuider Z, which is mostly in industrial parks today. So I think there's a lot of promise. Well, you would agree with that, would you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, sir.
We've studied things to death down where we are, too.
Yes, sir. I appreciate it greatly, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate all of you being here today, and I must say, reading your testimony last night gave me a lot of hope in terms of growing partnerships between being a good steward of our planet and along with the business community taking a larger and larger role in that. And you know, you mentioned industry wanting certainty and a level playing field, and I believe that that's very true when you talked about insurance, indemnification, and infrastructure. But yet, industry, you know, here on Capitol Hill, industry still knocks on our doors and says, we want to get rid of all of these regulations. Not all of them, but, you know, we're continuing to lobby against so much of some of the regulations that are out there. And I represent a large agricultural community, so I hear from my farmers all the time about regulations and how that interferes and them being bigger producers of whatever they're growing. But, you know, when are we gonna hit that tipping point where I know in California, you know, labor became, you know, a great partner in all of us who were trying to improve our climate and became a big partner in that. When do you think business is really, on a more global basis here in the United States anyway, is going to become a better, a true partner in understanding that we're all going to be winners if we collaborate together to begin to solve some of these issues? It's just, if anybody to answer.
Well, let me at least begin to answer that question, and it's a difficult question because it's such a
There's so many variables.
There's so many variables,
Yeah, I
right?
understand.
Depends the sector you are. I mean, the regulation you're facing. In some cases, perhaps.
But at some point, we're going to hit a tipping point.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess-
broadly speaking.
I guess the point I would make is being active on these topics for maybe the last 10, 12, 15 years from an insurer's perspective. I've never seen the level of sincere action from business. Now, I lived in Switzerland for many years, and I worked for a Swiss company for the last 20 or so years, so perhaps I'm tainted a little bit from a European perspective. But I will say that there is momentum growing, and there are companies who are willing to make commitments and live by those commitments and start to alter their own behaviors based on the commitments they're making. So I would agree with you. I don't think we've hit that tipping point yet. But I would say that we are closely approaching it.
Well, that's good to hear. You talked about, I think someone mentioned that this last year was a lower disaster year than previous years. It did not feel that way in my district. I represent Ventura, the county of Ventura in California, and 15 months ago we had the largest fire in California's history until just recently we had the Woolsey fire, which then the Thomas Fire was no longer the largest. We had Northern California fires, including Woolsey, that then became the largest fires in California. So the whole county virtually in my district is in that place of rebuilding, and I feel like I know FEMA better than I've ever known FEMA before.
Congressman, we're actually doing a report on one of our post-event review capability reports on exactly that event. So we will have, as we've done with 15 other events around the world, we'll have a diagnostic assessment of not so much the physical activity, but almost the human-induced environment in which that activity happened. Because what we find is that natural hazards or natural events do not always have to be natural disasters. And often it's either the policy decisions or the behaviors or other actions that humans have taken that actually exacerbate the event itself. So we'll have a report, I think, within the next few months that certainly we can work with your office. And
I would love that. And that's on the Woolsey fire then? Was it the Woolsey or the Thomas, do you know?
I don't know exactly which
Okay.
fire, but I know it's the California wildfire.
Okay, terrific. Well, the line of questioning I was going for, and I know I'm running out of time as well, but in terms of that rebuilding, you talked about how we've got to rethink how we rebuild after these disasters to build a more resilient community. And my question is, if you were us, what kind of policy would you put forward in terms of a national policy? Because there's disasters across the country, and FEMA and the Army Corps and others are putting a lot of money into rebuilding. But are we rebuilding in a way that is going to help us in the future? So I've run out
So
of time.
answer briefly, but then if you would provide a more detailed response for the record.
We'll certainly do that. I'd say the Congress took a great step last year with the DRRA. The Section 1234 that provides a 6% mitigation fund to FEMA. If our numbers are right, and we think they're conservative, 1 to 5, meaning you invest $1, you're going to save $5, $250 billion, I think, will go into that fund. Imagine how much money is going to be saved. So I would continue to find ways to fund mitigation through the existing mechanisms we have as one start, but we'll certainly follow up with other answers as well.
Thank you. Mr. Carter, you're recognized.
Thank you, and thank all of you for being here. I appreciate it very much. I think this is a very important subject. First of all, let me start off by saying that I believe that climate change is real. I believe the climate's been changing since day one, and I believe that we have to do a number of things in order to address this situation. A couple of those things are we have to adapt, we have to mitigate, and we have to innovate. This is what I have been talking about, resiliency, and what we need to be doing, because there's no question about it. I represent the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of coastline. We've had 3 hurricanes in the last 3 years, and we've seen what has happened, and we've experienced this, and it's important that we build up resiliency and not just after the fact. I wanted to start with you, Mr. Walker, because I also have a grandbaby in New Orleans, so I'm very concerned about what y'all are doing down there. I want to make sure y'all take care of my grandbaby, okay?
I think they've already taken care of New
Yeah, they have. But just don't get her talking funny like this other guy. Anyway, nevertheless. Okay, I got some serious questions here, serious. But I do believe that it's going to take adaptation, mitigation, and innovation.
The subtitles for his comments are down below the digital screen.
I like that. Sounds like Wendell.
Nevertheless, I want to ask you, do you think that we are focusing, and not only just on this committee, but just in general, when we talk about climate change? I mean, everybody wants to talk about, oh, we got to decrease carbon, we got to do this, and now all that's important, I agree, but at the same time, I don't feel like we're emphasizing the resiliency enough. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
You know, whether it's a fire in California or whether it's a flood in Houma, Louisiana, you know, you have to do something different. You can't keep doing the same thing. And so, you know, we finally realized that we had to do that. You know, after Andrew, after Katrina, they started strengthening the building codes. I mean, that's wonderful. We get stronger and better construction that can withstand the wind.
That's right, and not to interrupt you, but you're exactly right. I give the example all the time. We've got a barrier island off of Savannah, Tybee Island. We're rebuilding the road now. You know, 4 or 5 times a year, that road floods, not because of rain, but because of spring tides. Because the tides get so high, it floods. Well, we need to build it up. We need to be smart about these kind of things. I also give the example of, if you build a house on a slab next to the marsh, guess what? At some point, it's going to flood.
Get wet, right. We understand that down in Louisiana. You know, after Ike, we've raised over 1,000 homes in my parish. We're doing everything we can. We've rebuilt the barrier islands. We're building levees. We've raised homes. We're putting floodgates. We've got one of the largest floodgates in North America on our major waterway, the Houma Navigational Canal. So you have to do it all, and you can't just do one thing. You know, I'm only active on the Morganza, you know, project primarily, but you can't sit back and wait for it to be done the same way every time. You got to adapt.
Mr. Carter, can I jump
Yeah,
in
please.
with a different answer? Another area that we've identified through our PERC analysis reports is that communication, how we talk about risk, is not infiltrating policymakers or individuals or decision makers. The insurance industry is part to blame there. We talk about 100-year events. We talk about 1 and 250-year events. Yeah, I'm not going to be 200 years old, so once I go through one of those, my natural assumption is I'll never see one again. Whereas, if you think about the likelihood of being in a fatal car crash in the district in Washington, D.C., 1 in 14,000. But every time we get in a car, that's in the back of our mind, if not the front of our mind. We drive safely, so we're not in a fatal car crash. Get in an airplane, your chances of dying in a plane crash are 1 in 11 million. But when you're in the air, or at least when my wife is with me in the air, you're thinking constantly about the possibility of an event. We don't have that frontal lobe kind of awareness and understanding about natural hazards, not only in this country, but I think across the world. And we need to do something to make this a more natural, that you would actually wonder why you don't rebuild that road in a different way.
Exactly. And real quickly, just 2 more things. Another example from Tybee Island, when we were having flooding there, we found out just how important sand dunes are. And we got to make sure that we're replacing those sand dunes. And you can't, it's not always that you can wait on nature to do it. I mean, how can we assist in that? That was one of the things that we really worked hard on. The other thing I want to mention, because it's real big in my district, as it's probably real big in everybody's district, is the National Flood Insurance Program. You know, some of these homes we bought 2 or 3 times. I mean, that's ridiculous. We got to be smarter than this. You know, whatever you think about climate change, we have to be resilient. we have to be smarter. And that's what that's just the point that I'm trying to make here. And I realize my time's out. Boy, 5 minutes flies, I tell you. But thank y'all for what you're doing. And Madam Chair, if I may, this is a good hearing today. And this is something we can all agree on. We do need to be more resilient. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Mr. Caston, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses. I would especially like to thank Mr. Bouchard, whose corporate headquarters are just outside Illinois 6, but draws on what many people have told me are the smartest, best-looking, and most humble people in the country.
By the way, I want the record to show that was not in my testimony.
So climate change is I'm glad we're having this hearing because it is a fundamental, deep, deep threat to our financial system. And I don't think we've really internalized what that risk is in the way that we are making investment and business decisions, oftentimes not in as informed a way as we should have. I want to give a couple numbers. My colleague, Mr. Palmer, mentioned the historic record. So let me just walk through some historic numbers. The Earth has already warmed about 1 degree Celsius since the 19th century. In the last few decades, as we've all talked about, there's been these extreme weather events. We've seen Arctic ice sheets melting. Wildfire seasons are getting longer. Parts of Alaska are on fire. Mosquitoes are moving north carrying tropical diseases. It's only just begun. We are talking, the most ambitious goals in Washington are talking about limiting future temperature rise to 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. If you look back at the historic record over the last million years, there's a lag time, but every degree in temperature rise on average is about 2 meters of sea level rise. We have already got baked in 2 feet of sea level rise as it sits right now. What that means when you add that up is we are looking at sea level rise that we know is coming about the height of this room. Louisiana's done. Florida's done. And we don't think about that. As you pointed out, Mr. Bouchard, our brains don't process these risks, but we have to deal with them. And when I asked I sit on the Science and Space and Technology Committee, when I asked one of our scientists at that level of sea level rise, what are the cities you're most concerned about? Her response was the eastern seaboard. So what does that mean if you're a property manager investing on assets in Miami Beach? What does that mean if you're a seed developer who has seeds that are not going to be able to germinate in my home state of Illinois within my lifetime? I think if you're an investor, you'd like to know the answers to those questions. And the risks that we are facing in our financial system are going to make the 2008 financial crisis look like a walk in the park. Now, it is also a fantastic opportunity because almost everything we do to lower CO2 emissions means that we burn less fuel, and fuel ain't free. I spent my whole career helping businesses do that, and I know that sometimes in this town we think about spending money as how do you pay for it. In the rest of the world, it's called an investment. And it's a pretty good thing when you can invest money and save money. And I think we've got a real opportunity, provided that businesses understand both the costs of the risk they're exposed to and where there are investments that they have to hedge that exposure. So I want to start with Mr. and everybody is saying your name wrong, Jay Bush.
That's pretty good.
In your testimony, you discuss how the nature of these underappreciated risks and opportunities often distort investment and capital deployment.
Yeah.
Would standardized disclosure of those risks, including those that result from a corporation's supply chain, risk to physical assets, and from the nature of their business plan, help investors like you better identify and better allocate capital?
Yeah, Congressman Caston, one of the things I said in my testimony was that there haven't been great guideposts to help investment managers figure out where in relative terms to place your forward-looking bets, just because there isn't a standard, there isn't a required disclosure, there's no general agreed accounting principles. There's just everyone's best guess. And there's relative how do each company stack up inside of their own industry type of thinking, but nothing that is concrete and standard the way that regular financial regulations and disclosures are. So yeah, I have to conclude that would certainly help.
Well, I hope before you leave, you and Mr. Perna swap business cards, because in your testimony, Mr. Perna, you'd mentioned that your CDP disclosure is both qualitative and quantitative and based in part on existing SEC disclosures. Can you maybe expand on the prior comment and explain why it's important to have qualitative and quantitative disclosures in a standard format?
Yeah, because we're not talking about completely concrete issues, as we just talked about. There are variables, and companies have to maintain a certain amount of nimbleness and qualitative judgment over the kinds of remedies they undertake. And as you pointed out, an investment also requires a little secret sauce, so a qualitative disclosure allows the company the flexibility to try to put their best face forward. That being said, standardization is, invaluable. And we are very active, and as I mentioned, we're trying to align. We've been sort of a placeholder until there was some sort of guidepost that could be said to be standardized and nationwide. In the meantime, however, we have aligned ourselves with the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure because they're seeking this kind of standardization. I guess I got a red light
I can't
there.
tell if am I already over on my time? Oh, all right. Well, I had a bunch more, but let me just
I know
quickly
you were just
say
getting
that
started.
The reason for this questioning is I'm very proud to have introduced H.R. 3623, the Climate Risk Disclosure Act, along with Senator Warren, which would do exactly this, quantify these disclosures, and would basically help us understand what the exposures are to companies, both in terms of their contributions to global warming and which companies have a strategy that is a useful hedge against that so that we can better allocate capital. Bill's been endorsed by over 50 organizations. Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter a letter of support for those organizations.
Without
into the
objection.
record. And I'm way over my time, so I just urge all my colleagues to please join the bill. Thank you. I
Thank you,
yield
Mr.
back my negative time.
Ms. Miller, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, and thank you all for being here today. I know that many of our American businesses work diligently to be good stewards of our environment. My home state of West Virginia, due to geography, has had a lot of flooding, and I've seen how important it is for our communities and businesses to partake in pre-disaster mitigation to minimize the impacts of these natural disasters. As this committee moves forward in making recommendations, we must ensure that we further protect businesses from burdensome regulation. Mr. Walker and Mr. Bouchard, what is available to small businesses at present to allow them to be involved in pre-disaster mitigation?
I'm not sure what programs there are, but I can tell you that for years, the people down where we are avoided trying to do it themselves. It took repetitive, storms to come through to finally, get people moving down where we are. We, as I said, we taxed ourselves twice now to try to do what we do. And the reason we did that is there was not a lot of help from anything else. There was not a lot of other programs back then that we could rely on. And so the first times we tried to do that, the tax failed. But once you get beat up over and over and over, people tend not to do something until they've experienced a problem with it, right? And that's what happened down where we are. And finally, we got enough, and that's when we did what we did. I'm sure there's things now that can be utilized, but back then, we really didn't have anything else.
I guess I would, I might not have the accent, but I'm going to use a Louisiana example as well. Zurich was a sponsor of a golf tournament in New Orleans the year right before Katrina hit. And following Katrina, we saw firsthand that it was really small business that felt the brunt. It was small business that wasn't returning, which meant people weren't coming back for the jobs. It meant people didn't have to go to a store or a dry cleaner or a restaurant to attend. It was so your point about focusing on small business is the critical one before the event, not after the event. I would say that in terms of what is particularly or directly available to small business is probably I know that an organization that I'm part of, SBP, does education, resilience education for small businesses. So I think one thing that small business owners need to do is really understand their exposure, really understand not the exposure, only the exposure to their physical building, their storefront or whatnot, but the people who work for their businesses. And are they going to be able to come into the office? Are they going to be able to come to the store and the shop? And there's a lot more that you have to think about when you think about business continuity, particularly a small business person who one or two people don't come to work, and that's really going to have an impact as opposed to a 1,000 employer type of organization that perhaps that's not going to have as much of an impact. So I would say education is certainly a part of it, and I would encourage small businesses in their local organizations to really start to demand a voice and a place at the table for local communities talking about pre-event mitigation.
Along those same lines, is planning for climate risk something that many small businesses have the resources or bandwidth to do?
Probably not. That's why I would not sit here and recommend that every small business go out and undertake the same level of disclosure and scrutiny that Zurich has done and many other global firms have done. I can tell you, as the last staff person to look at the CDP filing before it goes to management, it takes a lot of time to do this, to do it sincerely at least. So no, I don't think that we can expect small business to have that same level of depth of knowledge, but they can work with their insurance agent. They can identify their basic risks and the risks to their people, and again, ask and engage in the community level to say, hey, small business in this area needs more focus on preparation because we're the ones who are going to pay the brunt after an event.
You're right. Mr. Walker, I enjoyed your testimony when you talked about how the economy in Louisiana is dependent upon the energy industry. I see the same in my state. What are some of the best practices that you have seen in Louisiana to increase resiliency both in your communities and actions taken by small business?
Like I said, way back we realized that we needed to do something. You know, my community now has a hazard mitigation plan that we update every year, but we actually completely go through that on a 5-year basis. And so we look at every risk in our, in our community with that plan. And so I think that was a good start to the process of what we really needed to build. It got all of the local community leaders in line to be able to do what we needed to do to control our risk. Same thing at our state level. We have a state master plan, and CPRA, Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, couldn't get it out, was started so that we could look at those risks and go through an assessment of what really needs to be done and the focus of what funding we have needs to go. And so I think, it's at the community level that it needs to start, and then it builds from there. But, right now we've assessed that we had to block the storm surge that was coming in from every storm. I mean, it was just happened over and over and over, and that's where the Morganza system came to bear. And so now, finally that we're making progress, we can see some of the fruits of it. Like I said, this past storm came through, it was only a Category 1. We had about 60 to 65 mile an hour winds in Houma. Normally we would have had a lot of flooding for that. We still had a little bit, but even with that Category 1 storm, we had storm surges up to 8 or 9 feet. Some of the levels of the system that we have were only built to that level. So we had some overtopping. Ultimately, we'd like to get it up to 18 feet. I don't know. You may have a storm that can get over that. I'm not going to be in Houma when that happens. but certainly having nothing was just a repetitive process of destruction and having to rebuild every time. So right now we're feeling that we're making some progress on it.
Thank you.
Mr. Levin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor. The topic of today's hearing is extremely important because not only is climate change a threat to the health of our communities, but also to our economic prosperity. So I thank you all for the good work that you're doing. I think it's important that those risks are explained and quantified, which is one reason I'm proud to support the Climate Risk Disclosure Act, which my friend Representative Caston spoke about a minute ago. This important bill would require public companies to disclose how they'll be impacted by the climate crisis, creating an environment of transparency for investors. And before I get to questions, I did want to take just a moment and address some of the arguments I've heard against taking bold action. Sometimes we hear the arguments from business, sometimes from other people here. First, we hear that the United States is already reducing greenhouse gas emissions better than anybody else, so we don't need to take any further action or make significant policy changes. I think it's clear that any reductions are hampered by the backwards policies that we're seeing from this administration. We only need to look to the 3.4% increase in carbon dioxide emissions in 2018 to illustrate this point. To the extent we're making progress in large part because of the aggressive actions taken at the state and local level, such as the proliferation of state renewable portfolio standards, as well as the policies of the last administration, like the fuel economy and tailpipe standards that President Trump's EPA is working so hard to undermine. I applaud my friends on this day in the state of California for their major announcement that they went out and they negotiated a deal, my friend Mary Nichols and others, our Attorney General, with 4 major auto companies. That is a big, big deal, and I wish we had that kind of leadership from this administration. I've also heard, secondly, that the U.S. shouldn't act on climate because China and India aren't doing it, so why should we? But I think we should measure all of the things we are doing with the international impact and specifically the term followership. So this is a good friend of mine, David Victor at UC San Diego. Professor Victor always talks about how our actions and policies lead to other countries' similar actions and policies to reduce emissions, or are the actions we're taking enable others to pollute freely with no regard for climate impact? When we fail to lead, we're letting ourselves and others off the hook, and that's sometimes something we fail to acknowledge. So I think we've got to continue to use our economic power and our political power to pull others with us. Third, some say that reducing greenhouse gas emissions will put people out of work. The reality is that the transition to clean energy creates jobs with high wages. The renewable energy industry is now one of the country's major employers. Almost 3.3 million people work in clean energy in this country, which is 3 times more than the fossil fuel industry. And the industry is continuing to grow, and in 2018, the renewable energy industry was the fastest growing workforce in 12 states in the Union. These are jobs that can and must be made available to Americans living in all regions of the country, not just in California. And finally, I've heard that emissions reductions will cost too much, but today's testimony from you confirmed that the climate crisis could cost companies almost $1 trillion, while acting to address the crisis could have more than $2 trillion in upside due to increased revenue. So the real costs are driven by failing to act. You know, I'm tired of people saying that they believe or don't believe in climate change. We believe in things that we may or may not know to be true. We know that climate change is true. The scientific evidence is overwhelming, and we've got to take action. And with that, I'll turn to questions. Mr. Perna, in your testimony, you mentioned that European companies report more than double the potential business opportunity associated with climate solutions when compared to American companies. You say this could be related to the European Union's clear climate policy framework. Can you expand on this point, and specifically, are there policies that create business opportunity in Europe, or is it just the fact that they have a climate policy framework at all?
No, I think there's some specific things. Again, back to Paris, which is a framework and a sort of a universal target system. People can find their own way to the target, so that gives the companies the nimbleness they need, but everybody knows we're trying to get to 2.2 degrees of Fahrenheit increase maximum. There are also some interesting things with regard to finance, the establishment of benchmark for indices that require companies that you can only be eligible to be listed in that index if you have a science-based target that is conforming with Paris. So if you're not aware of the science of Paris and building that in your business plan, you may be ineligible to be listed in European investment vehicles. So they're throwing out the companies that, so this gives companies a guidepost to think about. You want to be in that index, I better get with the Paris science. And so, you know, the combination of science, policy, and capital, it's only worked together once in my experience, which was in in Paris, where you had science, policy, and capital working together. In the absence of U.S. leadership relative to Paris, that policy piece, the third leg on that stool, is very collapsed because we're a big economy. If we were in there, and David Victor's exactly right, we're permitting people to do things which are not in their own interest or in the interest of people around them by a lack of coherence in a policy. Whatever the policy, it has to be coherent. And I can give you more details, but I think the differentiation between a coherent policy and a grab bag of policy is a very big obstacle for us.
Thank you. And I see the red light in the corner of my eye, and I'll yield back. I thank the chair for this great hearing today.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me ask you all a question, just simply yes or no. Do you believe that our own federal government, and I want to be clear, I'm not talking about any particular administration, just collectively, our own federal government is doing a good job with adaptation and resiliency? Just a yes or no?
No.
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 Have to say no as well.
Madam Chair, the thing is, I mean, look, you and I have discussed this. This is the space where I used to work for many years. We've identified the stupidity, and it's here. It's right here. It's in this city. It's in this body. We are not taking the steps and the policies. We are accepting mediocrity. We are watching as the Corps of Engineers, and I've said this before, my friend Mr. Huffman, I mean, they may be slow, but at least they're expensive. And everybody laughs, but it's sad because it's Mr. Bouchard, it's our money. It's the federal government's money. It's your company's money that we're shelling out needlessly. This is so stupid what we're doing. Study after study after study shows that for every $1 you invest, you get X dollars in return. You can find studies that show anywhere from $3 to $12. I think in some cases it's even higher. We have allowed for this process to just sit there and morph into this complete, just stagnant process that is victimizing the very people that we're representing. Mr. Walker's organization, collectively with some of the state funds that we put forth, and like you said, they've taxed themselves more than any other community in the nation and cobbled together, where are we, $420 million right now?
Over that, about 440.
$440 million trying to protect their homes, their families, their businesses. And as he said, and I hope that subtle remark he made, I hope that y'all heard it, because of what the federal government has done. That's what's made them vulnerable, and that we can't even get the federal government to come to the table and participate with them. But I'll pivot for just a minute. Mr. Perna, I'm curious, you made mention of the importance of stability or predictability, certainty, I don't remember which word you used. Couldn't agree with you more. How do we establish certainty, predictability? How do we do that when, as I said in my opening statement, that the U.S. is on a trajectory of reducing emissions. China is quadrupling the offsets that we're achieving. So how do you project certainty when you have such uncertainty?
Well, I think, as you pointed out, the global regime, I mean, China is a signatory to Paris. We are the only country that is outside of that consensus. So the certainty is, Paris is trying to build to that certainty. I also think there's different kinds of certainty. There's scientific certainty. You can manage your business to at least to that certainty. And with regard to the leakage...
Well, let me ask this. Is their increase in emissions, is that contributing to certainty or contributing to uncertainty?
Well, I think that's a bit apples and oranges, because the leakage that you're talking about, emissions going up here, down there, I take a plane, you take the train. You take a plane, I take my bicycle. We're constantly trading off the tonnage that we are causing to be emitted. That's the same among companies. But you can balance that with a cap of some kind, a reduction target of some kind. That's the certainty that's missing, which is what is the minimum amount of emissions that an ordinary company should be permitted to emit under certain circumstances, given a certain amount of time. And that's where it becomes complicated. But I think, certainty comes to us from all different, in all different forms.
I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure how a country that is substantially increasing their emissions in any way does anything other than contributes to the uncertainty by sending the trajectory upward into concentrations we've never experienced. It's especially concerning. But let me pivot. Madam Chair, as you know, every hearing I have, I want to give a compliment to my friend, Mr. Huffman, and today will not be an exception. I like a lot of things about you, Mr. Huffman, and one of the things I like about you is that one of the challenges that we've experienced with the Morganza project is this essential fish habitat issue, where the National Marine Fisheries Service has come in and determined that when land erodes, it becomes essential fish habitat. So if you're going to come back and restore it, you have to mitigate for impacts to the fish. The fish didn't mitigate for taking our land. I don't know why we're forced to mitigate for taking theirs. Mr. Huffman worked incredibly well and cooperative effort with us to come up with a solution for that passed the House. We're still working on the Senate, but I want to thank you for that. Mr. Walker, you noted that some of the regulatory challenges, in many cases, y'all are carrying out projects that are actually environmental in nature, and our own federal government regulations designed to protect the environment are actually impeding you. Could you talk about that a little bit?
One of the biggest things that gives me heartburn is we have to mitigate to build a levee. Why do we mitigate to build the levee? That is the mitigation. We've already seen where freshwater marshland is building back behind the system. So, you know, that's another thing we really want to study, is that we think just the fact that we're building that levee is improving the habitat. I mean, we know it is. So, you know, those are the kind of things that drive us crazy. And, you know, some of the other things that we face are with permitting. And we've had some good partners down where we are, you know, ConocoPhillips, Apache, all companies that own the majority of the marshland there where we are have been our partners to gain access and right-of-ways to build these levees. But the permit process requires that they give us a perpetual servitude. Who wants to give up their land into perpetuity? So we've been facing those kind of things down there where hopefully at some point we can gain some ground with that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It makes it real costly because mitigation's not cheap.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make note that it may seem counterintuitive that a levee is actually protecting an ecosystem, but when it's exposed to open water, it erodes, you lose it all. The levee system actually stabilizes the ecosystem that's protected behind it. And we've got a number of examples in Louisiana. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for.
Well, thanks, Madam Chair. It's fun to hear Mr. Graves speak eloquently about the value of investing in adaptation, how we can actually get a multiplier effect from those investments. The good news is we don't have to just talk about treating the symptoms here. We can also get a multiplier effect by investing in decarbonizing and actually treat the disease. My understanding, Mr. DePerna, Ms. DePerna, you studied over 7,000 companies and found that over half of them were able to identify business opportunities in the transition to a low-carbon economy, and you found a multiplier effect for a lot of those companies, didn't you?
Yes, that's what they disclose, that there are lots of opportunities that come along with you know, taking measures to come into conformity with the need to reduce, increase revenue, competitive advantage, even cheaper access to capital. Because
those opportunities outweighed the cost of transition by a factor of 7 in some cases. Is that?
I think we set up factor, at least for the sample of the 500 largest companies, I think it was double.
Thank you. Mr. Bouchard, I'm fascinated by your perspective on all this, because I think if we were all in the business of risk, and especially for reinsurers, the ultimate backstop for huge risks, we would have solved this thing a long time ago. I've been working on carbon capture and sequestration for quite some time. And at our last hearing, I bristled a little bit when somebody referenced natural gas as a climate solution, as clean energy, because it's not. When you factor in the methane loss, I think it's likely no cleaner than coal. And my belief, because I think we're in a crisis here, is we don't have time for fake solutions. I am rapidly coming to the conclusion that carbon capture and sequestration is a fake solution. Over a decade ago, I wrote a bill in California to try to set standards for geologic carbon capture and sequestration, because my mind was open. If we could find a way to dramatically reduce emissions, I found myself working with Chevron and other fossil fuel companies to try to get this done. We walked into a buzzsaw of technical problems. And that bill, despite the support of all of this industry, despite bipartisan support in the California legislature, didn't go anywhere. I then found myself in Zurich, speaking at a carbon capture and sequestration conference hosted by Swiss Re that year, where I got to hear a little bit of an inside perspective from the industry, where I heard enormous skepticism from technical experts and economic experts in the industry that this would ever be cost effective or ever be feasible at scale. And here we are today, fast forward to 2019, and we still hear people talk about carbon capture and sequestration as the holy grail, but there are no projects that are actually doing it. We have a few that get the Petronova power plant and others that get bandied about. They're doing enhanced oil recovery. They're not helping with the climate. They're actually producing more oil. So I was intrigued to hear you say that you're offering liability coverage for carbon capture and sequestration. I'm just wondering, are those policies selling?
No, they're not, sir.
Sounds like a pig in a poke to me. Do you have any reason to disagree?
I think when you look at the role that we play, and we're not a reinsurer, we're a direct insurer, right? So we're actually engaging directly with the
Okay.
industrial companies that are trying to look at these different solutions. You know, our role is to find a way to manage the risks that they would be facing for such a project. So what we did is we combined kind of the technology expertise we had for our underground storage tank business with our traditional energy business and found a way to create a liability policy that we felt quite comfortable.
Okay, so you can figure out the cost of that risk. You can offer that liability policy.
Yeah,
but
we think we can, but there has not been a lot of, shall we say, market demand.
And that seems to me a very significant fact. And I thank you for telling us that, because if people were serious about really doing this, as opposed to the feel-good advertisements we see on TV all the time that say that, gosh, Exxon's already, addressing the climate crisis because of carbon capture and sequestration. Nobody's even serious enough to buy an insurance policy. I think that tells us a lot. The other question I have for you is that you and your clients are basically picking up the externalized cost of decades of enormous profits from the fossil fuel industry. Do you have any advice, if you were advising the uninsured folks who are also picking up those externalized costs, and I'm talking about governments basically, and communities and folks that don't have fancy insurance policies. You're in the risk business. What would you advise governments to do to manage their risk?
Looking at the form that those externalized costs take today, it really goes back to that protection gap that I cited in my testimony. It's that gap between the economic losses and the insured losses. So I think there are multiple things we can do. One is we can encourage more parties to not be uninsured, whether it's municipalities, whether it's businesses, unfortunately, whether it's individuals. If you look at a typical catastrophic event, say a hurricane or a large flood in the United States today, half of the losses go to individual households that are uninsured under the program today. So we can do a better job of expanding, the tools that are out there today to insure many people. And then I would say government, and we've been talking about it this whole hearing, can and should be focusing on creating these adaptation and mitigation programs that minimize those externalities.
Mm-hmm. Should those be funded by redirecting those externalized costs back to those who have been able to externalize them so well for so many decades?
Well, I think that's your job as a congressman and a policymaker to determine kind of how to allocate funds and collect those funds. But I think there's, as the DRRA last year shows, there's funding already available in some forms that can make a major impact in mitigation today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses for your outstanding testimony and our members who are here today. I think it's clear that we need to raise the consciousness of the American people, businesses, and hardworking folks about the escalating risk and cost of the climate crisis, and to focus on the opportunities ahead and the solutions. And we have some time to do this, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'll encourage all of you to answer some questions that we'll pose in writing to follow up. I'd also like to let everyone know that the Climate Crisis Committee is going to go on the road. We're going to have our first field hearing starting in Colorado next week at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and other folks focused on mitigation and adaptation and the solutions and opportunities for the future. So thank you all again. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses. Please respond. With that, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. Good job. Very good. Hey, you were the talk of the town.
More bullets coming my way.
Good job.
Jason should look like that. I'm your Sherpa. You're going to get me? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to, you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to call to jump on it before, but we'll go. But you take your time. Okay, you take your time. We'll find it.